Welcome to the Dead Pixel Society podcast, the photo imaging industry's leading news source. Here's your host, Gary Pageau. The Dead Pixel Society podcast is brought to you by Media Clip, Advertech Printing, and IP Labs.
Hello again and welcome to the Dead Pixel Society podcast. I'm your host, Gary Pageau, and today we're talking to Adi Segal, the CEO of Hapi, and he's coming to us from New Jersey, the happiest place on earth. Hi, Adi. How are you today?
Gary, clearly you've never been to New Jersey before. Thanks for having me.
Garden State is a wonderful place in certain places. Anyway, let's not get into that. We're here to talk about your company, what they do, and how they help businesses train and improve employees through active listening. What's your background and how did you come to start the company?
My background goes, I'll start even before the academic stuff. As a teenager, I trained and then volunteered and continued to this day as a volunteer EMT, emergency medical technician. And so one of the things that you learn there is that people often are calling 911 because they're lonely. There are very few emergencies, right? Emergencies. And this is what you learn. We were just talking before we started the show. You're a parent of 4, so you probably know how to stay calm. But very, very few emergencies actually occur, right? Cardiac arrest, that's an emergency. Respiratory distress, that's an emergency. Strokes, missing limbs, things like that, right?
Yeah.
Severe bleeding. Everything else people call an emergency or call 911 because they're frantic about something. Perhaps it's in your head or there's something really happening, but you probably don't need lights and sirens to get to the ER.
Right.
One of the other things you learn when you're doing that, though, is just simply being there and listening for people goes a really, really long way. And remaining calm. I was not, a big believer in this was going to be the world's solution to all of our problems listening, but I think it's something that stuck with me through most of my education. And then you said, how did I get to here today? So I was supposed to be a doctor, and in medical school, I decided that the world of health tech would be more exciting. So I left to join what became the largest telepsychiatry company in the world, and then start my own company. And then through a scenic tour of ups and downs as an entrepreneur, I was eventually recruited and hired to run Hapi, which was started as a nice little experiment out of Silicon Valley. And when they realized it could be a big business, they found me to help commercialize it. And I've been here a year, and I am now the biggest believer, I think, in active listening and active listening as a service, as well as the most important business skill. I don't think there's anything that can go farther in both running a company, improving company culture, employee retention and recruitment, as well as driving the bottom line as listening can.
Everyone thinks they're a good listener, right? Everyone thinks that, well, I'm hearing what they're saying. Someone's talking to me, but what do you mean by active listening? Because that's really much more, it's a process you have to learn, right?
It's definitely something you have to learn. Anyone who tells you, Gary, that they are a good listener is not. That's what my academic partners tell me. And they are some of the best listeners in the world. They say, anyone who claims to be is probably not a great listener. So we shouldn't necessarily adopt that or profess that we are good listeners. It's a work in progress. It's a life skill that you have to continue to exercise over time, like any type of muscle. And so what does it mean? Well, currently we use the term active listening. There are lots of other phrases. Some people debate whether we should use the word active. Some people call it deep listening, intentional listening, but it comes from this academic body. Carl Rogers years ago, that the father of listening, used it. But my understanding from reading a bunch of his texts, and as well as the academics who were his students, it's been taken out of context quite a bit. So maybe it's not active listening, maybe it's deep listening. I actually quite like that term, or intentional listening. And so what does that mean at its heart? It means that actually what you're doing right now is not interrupting. Listening to understand is our favorite phrase. It's was one of our academic partners and advisors, Professor Avi Kluger from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's probably one of the leading academics in the field. He loves to talk about listening to understand, because that really explains what you're doing. You don't want to do this thing where you're constantly thinking of the next answer, the next question. Right.
Which is what I'm doing right now. But we're going.
well done, Gary. Yeah. You want to be able to sit with the person's thoughts and really understand what they're saying.
Mhm.
And this works phenomenally, whether it's in your personal relationships, conflict resolution, whether it's peacemaking across international borders, or in the workplace, which is one of the things that we're here to talk about, is listen to understand. And I most importantly encourage executives and managers to try to listen to understand what their colleagues and their team is saying to them.
Right.
Don't just jump in because you think you're there to put out fires and have all the solutions. They probably know something you don't know. As someone who's been on both sides, been an entry-level employee as well as a manager, you know that people who are making those phone calls, the people who are in the field doing sales, they're the eyes and ears. They know best. They might not know exactly how to solve every problem, but if we can help understand what they're saying, we can work as a team to better come up with solutions, as well as better products and better services that we can sell to increase revenue over time.
Because I was going to get to that, because when you started that statement, it sounded kind of academic and kind of foo-foo, but you've managed to connect that to actual results. Right. I mean, you can demonstrate, as if your management team, and I'm sure your employees have to learn how to active listen too, right? That you can actually see better results. How do you track that?
You track that by training folks. And if you want to get back into the academic side, you can run a controlled experiment, which we do on our platform. We're constantly asking very quick. It's within a good user experience, though. We ask questions and we measure the outcomes on our platform, on the Hapi app, which is active listening as a service. And so we know that people feel better afterwards. We know that they were more happy with the conversation with, say, a stranger, or in our case, a trained listener, than they would have expected. And when you are able to have those conversations, both within the setting of our app or within the workplace, we know that you can drive more business. We've seen it time and again with our clients, and the research shows us. So one thing I do want to point out, though it sounds like we want to stay away from academics a little bit, is that there is some really good research coming out, again, from our partner, Professor Kluger, where he's found in a recent meta-analysis that the number one thing that you gain from good listening, from setting up a healthy conversation, is not a positive feeling, is not just making your day better. It's building a better relationship.
Right.
And you can draw ties from that. So Avi is a psychologist, a trained psychologist, but he doesn't sit in the psychology department or the medical school. He's actually the chair of the business department.
Right.
He's a behavioral psychologist. And so they're constantly looking for, how do we take some science we know from psychology and apply it to the business world? How do we better train our executives? How do we better train our MBAs? And the number one thing that they have seen that works is developing stronger relationships. And the number one thing that develops stronger relationships is enhanced and better listening. And with that, you build stronger teams and greater business outcomes.
You touched on a real interesting point, which was, there seems to be a lot of talk in the workplace today of, everyone getting along and, kind of kumbaya and things like that. But if you're actively listening to someone, you may not like what they're saying, right? So does your app and your service help with, dealing with that? Let's say, for example, you've got someone who is working for you and they're talking about the process they're working on and you don't like what they're saying. Do you help with responding to that?
I'll give you a yes and, Gary. So I do want to separate Hapi's offerings. So first of all, we have an app that you can get in the iOS or Android store. It's direct to consumer. Everyone should be on it. But that is active listening as a service, where we connect you with one of our trained and certified listeners. And of course, there you can always just vent and get it out. And we're here to listen. The other big part of our business is the Atlantic Listening Academy, which was originally created for our professional listeners. But as we were doing that, we realized, wait a second, this is actually applicable to everyone in every industry,
right?
From your garbage collector to your CEO, from your lawyer to your trauma surgeon, right? Everyone should be a better listener. In healthcare, because that is my background. In healthcare, they say you have about 11 seconds before your doctor interrupts you. And doctors are rushed. I get that. They, in a billing environment, they have about 15 minutes with a patient, and you're lucky if you get that. And they're trying to do this, what's called differential diagnosis right away. So they're trying to figure out what's going on. But the research also shows that by interrupting you where they think they're saving time, they're not actually cutting corners. It leads to worse outcomes and more expenses.
Right.
So that's a great category of industry where we think we can have a wonderful impact. We're not quite there yet, and we're here to talk about business. On the business side, we know that listening, even on that first call, that first customer call or prospective call, if you listen more than you talk, more than you try to sell, you have, I think, 300% more chance of selling them. And I'm not making up that number. That's been done with some of the AI tools that are out there that monitor sales calls today. It is just exponentially more useful to be able to listen to your prospective clients. But I want to get back to your actual question. I digress there, which is, what do you do in this environment? Maybe we label it toxic positivity, where everyone is just hunky-dory all day, right? And everyone just has to be happy at work. And by the way, that wasn't always the case. We're forgetting the water cooler of the days of yore, right? Where you would sit around. I used to have a bowl of mints on my desk. I worked at a nonprofit that was doing really good work in the healthcare space. And there was one colleague who worked around the corner, and she would come over, and she had this thing where she would call it mint and bitch. She would come over, take a mint from my desk, and just tell me what was going on. That used to happen. And I think we've been influenced by perhaps social media, perhaps photos, if that's the topic of this industry, things like Instagram, where you're really portraying your fake best life. Everyone has the perfect beach picture, the perfect hotel that they're staying at in Santorini.
You got to filter the face to make it look better.
Yeah. And what happens there is that then everyone ends up in a state of envy. You can't talk about how your kid was complaining the entire drive to school. Right. And then you didn't get an ounce of silence before walking into the office. Right. You have to pretend that life is perfect. And guess what, folks? Life isn't perfect. Right. And so what we allow you to do through both our app and the training is create a sense of reality and be able to sit with that.
Because I think that is sort of the management trend these days is, like you said, I like the phrase toxic positivity, because it is almost, listen to everyone, support every idea, validate everything, and everything will be great. And obviously you want people to be comfortable expressing themselves, but they almost feel obligated to express something positive, right? That they don't have the freedom really to point out the emperor has no clothes, for example.
Yeah. And so that's a lot of what we see on our app is people coming to us because they don't have a place to express it, even in their most intimate relationships. So what we see is that people do need a space to vent, and we through our training have our listeners create that space, and you can create that in any work environment. It starts at the top by being real, opening up. It means transparency. If the business doesn't look like it's going to meet its KPIs or its goals for the month, the quarter, the year, let's be honest about it.
And that was really blame, right? I mean, that's the other half of this is
exactly.
You have to be able to talk about, underperformance and something that needs to be changed without saying, and it's Bob who's doing it. For example, maybe you take Bob aside privately.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point, is that you can come up with what we like to call, again, this Professor Kluger thing, feed forward systems, where we're giving what we would traditionally call feedback, but really work on what are we doing to improve this? Here's what worked. Here's what didn't work. And also here's how I'm feeling. We forget about feelings these days because it makes you more real, and it actually allows you to progress as a team. If you realize that everyone on the team's human, no one's a robot. The entry level person who you hired to do cold calling, they probably don't like that job so much, but it's important. And we all hire them, right? And it's a great way to get into any industry, but life can suck on a given day. And you know what? It's really lonely at the top, right? So we did entry level, and now let's talk about CEOs. Right. No one will ever get the CEO experience, the founder experience, unless you've done it before. And so we want to give everyone a space for that. The CEO should be honest with their teams about here's what's going on.
Mhm.
And we like to talk about, I was just in conversation with one of my mentors and board members on LinkedIn. He wrote a whole post about what's known as skip level meetings.
Mhm.
So you have your entry level talk to, say, a VP. They're not just talking to their middle manager, or you go straight to the CEO. You learn so much that way on both sides of it.
Right.
And the idea of being an open-minded learner, even when you're at the top of your game, is super important. And the only way you're going to do that is through really good, honed listening skills.
Because I think what people don't think about when they consider these things as a manager is this stuff builds on itself. If someone's having a bad day making those cold calls, then they have to come back the next day and the next day, and they don't have a way. They've got to just put on the smiley face and grunt through it. You're probably going to have a hard time retaining that employee. I mean, that's the reality is you're not setting someone up for success without giving them a way to either share what they're saying or get help for what they're doing. Because possibly if they're sharing their experience, someone can say, well, I had that experience too, and this is how I helped with it. Yeah, well,
Gary, you've had a very impressive career. Let me ask you, what was the worst work environment that you've ever been in, and why?
Oh, I don't know if that's an interesting question, because it kind of varied, just on a personal level. And, most people who in the podcast who are listeners don't know this, but, for a while there, I tried to get into the insurance thing because I was like, I was working from home. So I was like, you know what? I really miss talking to people. And this is before I had the podcast, obviously. So I was like, you know what? Insurance, you got to talk to people. And I was not very good at it. And a lot of it was because of the prospecting piece, and because just, talking to people you don't know about, and because their presumption was, he's just trying to sell me something, right? That's how insurance sales is. There's a lot of presumption. And, the reality is, half the time I was talking to people, I'd look over what their coverage was, and it was like, yeah, no, you're doing fine. You're great. I can't add anything to this, right? So that was kind of frustrating. Just from that standpoint, was the presumption from the other person that I had, this sort of agenda, if you will. I don't know if that helps. I've now told you more than I thought I would ever tell on the podcast. So there you have it.
Well, Gary, what I heard you say was that your worst work environment was when you were the most honest. No, sir, I can't sell you something because you have great coverage.
Exactly. So worse, but it was probably the most uncomfortable, which is one of the reasons why I didn't stay in that, is because I was like, I'm not setting myself up for success, is basically what I was doing.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I know you haven't come out with your tell-all book yet, or even podcast, but one of the things that we were talking about beforehand was this plan as you saw the landscape changing in photography.
Yeah,
you and a bunch of executives at your former company got together and created a plan.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly. Yep.
What happened with that plan? Where was the listening there?
Well, there was a lot of listening, in the sense that we're listening to each other, which we thought we want, but that where we're listening was the actual customers, right? We kind of thought, and this was, for those of you in the industry who know the history, this was at PMA. We had and most of you don't know this, but we had a planning session to kind of plan PMA's future, and came up with a binder of actions to basically keep the association moving. This was in the early 2000s. And we basically didn't do any of the things in the binder. I still have it somewhere. It's kind of fun to flip through, but there were two disconnects there. One was there wasn't a lot of member input, and secondly, there wasn't a lot of vendor input. The people who were actually exhibiting at our trade show, which was 80% of our revenue, that was input that was not listened to. So,
yeah. It makes total sense, right? Obviously, everything hindsight 2020, you can do a post-mortem. You're like, yeah, duh. But one of my favorite business books is a small little pamphlet. If I wasn't connected in the audio system, I would go get it from my bookshelf to show you, but it's called Talking to Humans.
Yeah.
And all it is, it's the story of basically, I think it was an orthopedic specialist and a material scientist, and they came together and said, we're going to make the very best pillow.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And they sat in a lab and they made what they thought, based on ergonomics and science and the very best materials out there, the very best pillow.
Yep.
And they went out to the corner and they tried to sell it. and nobody bought it. And
Right.
when they went back to their business advisors and they said, well, this is the very best pillow, why isn't it selling? They were asked, did you ever talk to customers?
Right.
And the answer was no. So
Right.
you can't just have the most brilliant idea. This is why we believe, especially in the startup world, in rapid prototyping.
Mhm.
And try it with people. We do this even on our app. Some customers might see features that others don't. A/B testing, right? Before we build something complete, we want to see if there's any uptake in it.
This is shows you how small this world is. One of my side things, which again, most people don't, this is like Gary venting right now. I'm sharing people.
I'm here to listen, Gary.
Get used to this. One of my side things I do is I teach entrepreneurship in the prison system. So I help people who are incarcerated learn the skills to start their own business. And one of the books I use, they have to read, is Talking to Humans by Gift Constable. Yep. It is a small world, my friend. Adi, it's a small world. I know that book very well.
It's great. Everyone should read it. It's a little pamphlet.
It's free. You can get it. I mean, it's a PDF. You can download it.
Yeah. Yeah. We didn't even cover this in the pre-interview. I also do the same kind of volunteering. Convicts and ex-convicts, often in prison for the wrong reasons, are excellent entrepreneurs.
Oh, yeah.
And I just love, what's the organization that you work with to do this?
Well, it's through a community college. So I'm actually an adjunct faculty member through Jackson College here in Michigan, and we have a contract with the Michigan Department of Corrections. So it's a actual college course they take, along with, they can take, business, they can take English and things like that. So this is part of an education program they can partake in if they qualify.
Yeah, I love that. I volunteer with an organization called Defy Ventures, same kind of thing, mostly out of the New York, New Jersey area. But I'm just amazed every time I go to an event and I meet new mentees. These folks, they say as part of this, and I'm sure you've heard this too, criminals are actually very good entrepreneurs. They just applied their skills to the wrong thing. Right?
Oh, yeah.
And I love meeting with these folks because they feel refined in some way when they come out. These are the people who are using the prison library, if one exists, right? These are the people who are trying to do research. Right. And, I met a guy, this was pre-pandemic at this point, who had this full plan. He was pitching to the group. He was going to do some kind of glasses repair program, and he had a binder of a business plan that he had been working on, and he had all the connections and a vehicle that was going to be donated him ready to go. And I'm like, how long have you been out? And he's like, 4 weeks. And it's like his whole business was built because he was so dedicated to it and so smart. And I think that's something that all of your listeners can also get into, is volunteering some of your time, which is great for your mental health and mental wellness, and finding the other parts of society that we don't usually interact with. It really opens your eyes.
Yeah, just again, we're kind of diverging here, but the thing I find interesting is I have to go inside, right? So I'm actually teaching people who are incarcerated, and it's men and women both. It depends on the semester, what facility you're in. And it's just fascinating because I make it a policy where I know where I can look up why they're in there, but I don't do that. I don't want to know why they're there while they're a student. And there's more than once where I'm looking at some of these students and I'm like, why are you here? This person is a natural entrepreneur and they've got it figured out. And I have people who also teach at the college who teach conventional students, and they say, my incarcerated students are my best students by far.
Yeah.
Now they're not representative of the entire population of the prison. We're talking about a subset of a subset of a subset who are motivated and have the skills to actually, work towards a college degree. So I'm not, let's be, realistic there. But the experience I've had have been overwhelmingly positive.
On our next interview, we'll talk about prison reform.
Exactly. We're going to turn this into a whole separate podcast.
Right. We got education, healthcare, and prison reform so far.
So anyway, back to, I'm having a great time so far, but should this be offered, the active listening program? I mean, obviously you have your perspective from your business model, how it should be offered, but is this something somebody can offer as a employee benefit or a training program, or is this something that's better suited for an individual?
That's absolutely how we do it. So the way Hapi works with our B2B clients is that the company comes to us. Generally, it's from the CEO or a chief HR or people officer, and they say, one, we are starting to value listening, and two, maybe we're even having some communication issues within the company. And now more than ever, employees are starting to feel very stressed. It's a tough work environment. Certainly in startups, every VC is telling their companies to tighten their belts, and you're seeing layoffs at every other company. So you're thinking about when's my job going to go too?
Exactly.
So there's a lot of stress out there, and the pandemic's not fully over. Like there's everyone's working from home. There's a lot of reasons for communication to kind of be up in the air right now,
and so, also doesn't the and excuse me for interrupting. I was actively listening, but doesn't the preponderance of more electronic communication lead to more problems, actually, rather than solve them face to face?
I would say so. Just anecdotally, I don't have data. I'm not a researcher from that perspective, but I do know that we've seen trends of, just even think about when you get a text message or an email and you're going to lose your mind, and then you reread and you're like, oh, they didn't mean it that way, right? Text is so flat, whether it comes as an SMS or in an email or in a Slack message. Slack does one bit better where, they let you use emojis and GIFs and all sorts of things that maybe change the tenor. But it's still not the same as having a conversation, right? And so yes, the answer is yes. We need to improve our human-to-human communication because technology will never replace that. Sorry, ChatGPT, you're brilliant, but you're not going to replace humans. So yeah, what we say for our clients is come and let's talk about what's going on. We want to listen to you. What's going on in your company? We kind of do a small assessment and figure out where this is most applicable. Is it for the whole company? Do we roll it out with one team, or are there like inter-team? I don't know the size of a lot of your listeners' companies, but for small teams, obviously, maybe you would all do it. For teams, even 20 people or more, you might want to roll it out with one of your smaller pods first and see how it goes and see how it's adopted and almost get that organic promotion within the company. You can't believe what this amazing training that we did. So what we do there is we start you on our course, the Atlantic Listening Academy. That's fully asynchronous. It's self-paced. And we usually give you a timeline and we say, okay, we don't, the company does. And they say, you got to be done by this date because then we're doing a Hapi conference, right? We're going to do it a day, a half day, maybe it's just an hour where we bring in one of our expert trainers. Maybe it's someone you saw on the course, or maybe it's someone new that we're working with. We actually practice it. Like I mentioned earlier, this is a skill that needs to be exercised. And it's also very similar to, if you have any friends who are doctors, they'll certainly tell you that everything they learned was from residency, not from medical school.
Right.
And so what you need to actually do the skills. You need to see it in real life. You need to hear it for us in real life. You need to listen in real life. It's really great to know how to do it, but then you have to practice it. So we run a seminar for you, and then you're really into it. And then the party favor that we leave behind with companies is we contract with them with our app. Right. And so the app allows you to practice your listening both as a talker, and oftentimes what we see in our conversations is the roles flip somewhere in the conversation where your listener becomes the talker and you become the listener, because guess what? That's just as therapeutic. So we give you the full spectrum. You can pick and choose what you want, but those are the offerings that we have either bundled or unbundled.
Awesome. So where does someone go for more information about Hapi and either the app or the program? Where do you want them to go?
You can find us at hapi.com, HAPI.com. There you'll find links to both app stores as well as our academy. Our academy can be found on its own at atlanticlisteningacademy.com. And I'm sure we can put all the links in the show notes. And then if you're interested in just checking out the app on your own, you can go to either the Android or iOS app stores and you'll see them there. HAPI.
Well, thank you, Adi, for your insight and expertise and grilling me, which I'm not sure. I feel like I'm gonna need a moment after this, but thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Gary. This was a lot of fun. And just remember, I'm here to listen anytime you want, Gary.
Thank you for listening to the Dead Pixel Society podcast. Read more great stories and sign up for the newsletter at www.thedeadpixelssociety.com.